all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe, from character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods. We will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello, and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I am one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm your other host, Shelby or Shecup.
And we're here to talk about a kind of heavy topic, a heavy topic in Dragon Age history, and also maybe some heavy topics in our own real-world history. So it's not really fair to say that we're excited. I think interested to talk more about this topic in Dragon Age would probably be the right way to say it.
Probably so.
Yeah. So why don't you go ahead and introduce us to what we're talking about, and we can get started.
The topic for today is the Long Walk of the Elves and how the Dales gets established as a place for the elves in general. So before we dive in, I do have one trivia fact, and that is that apparently all of the Hala statues that litter the Winter Palace in Halamshiral during Inquisition were supposedly built during the Long Walk by Dalish artisans. We don't really know much more than that. Apparently there is, as you know from playing the game, there is magic imbued in them, but we don't, even the Orlaisians don't fully understand like how that came into practice, how it even was created. So that's another ancient elven thing that lingers. So let's just dive right in. And, you know, if you don't know anything about this topic, you can kind of put two and two together. You can kind of figure out, you can kind of guess, okay, yeah, this is when the elves travel to the Dales. And that is correct. And so before we dive into the Codex entry, I do want to give you guys some context and just summarize this event for those of you who may be rusty on your ancient age lore. So just the most bare bones explanation. As you know, Andraste and Mafarath led a war against the Tevinter Imperium. This was in the Ancient Age, and this was basically at the height of Tevinter's power, and they were had enslaved many elves. Actually, probably like almost all of the elves, to be clear. And most of the elves that were enslaved in Tevinter, they joined in this war to help because they wanted to be free. And if you remember Shartan, he was an elf, and he and his cohort of freed slaves or runaway slaves, they joined this war. And they were the first allies of Andraste. And so after the war, when it was over and Andraste was dead, Mafarath actually still honored her promises to the elves to give them land. And so he gave them the land of the Dales to make their new home. And so this is how Dalish even became a moniker in the first place. But before we get into the establishment of the Dales, which we'll talk about in the second half, I wanted to talk about how the elves get to the Dales. And this in-universe is called the Long Walk. And we do have a Codex entry that describes this walk. And so I want to read from it. And it says, "We called our journey the Long Walk, for that is what it was. We walked with what little we had on our backs. Some walked without shoes, for they had none. Whole families, women with infants, the young and old alike, all of them made their way across the land on foot. And if one of our people could no longer walk, we carried him, or sometimes left him behind. Many perished along the way. Some died of exhaustion, others simply gave up and fell by the wayside. A great number were set upon by human bandits, and even though we had few possessions, along the way, a growing number began to bemoan the decision to leave Tevinter. At least in Tevinter, they said, we had food and we had water and shelter. What do we have here? Nothing but the open sky and the prospect of the never-ending road ahead. Some turned back toward Tevinter, but most of us continued walking. And the gods rewarded those of us who did not waver by bringing us to the Dales. And our people called the new city Halamshiral, the end of the journey. And for a time, it was home. So that's the end of the Codex. And there are lots of things we could talk about here, that they travel all the way from Tevinter to southern Orlais. That's a long journey. You may be wondering, it says nothing but the open sky and the prospect of the never-ending road. They traveled the Imperial Highway. So it actually was like a road. Obviously no cars, but that's what they traveled. And they eventually ended up in what would later become Halamshiral for a time, as the Codex says. But there are quite a lot of comparisons we could make to this event. And I do think it's interesting to compare to modern day history, to compare to other literature. And while these comparisons may not be the entire point of our podcast, I think it's really important, and I know Austin agrees, that it's really important to understand the history and the context and, the history of our world that informs the games. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I 100% agree with all that, and I want to get into that. And I also just want to kind of talk about a little thing that I noticed in the Codex while reading it. It noticed in something that some walked without shoes. And I just want to pause. I know we never get really an in-lore explanation for why some elves don't wear shoes, but hypothesizing a little bit, could it be that they don't wear shoes in honoring of their ancestors?
Yeah, I definitely think that's possible. It's interesting because this codex says specifically some walked without shoes for they had none. So the Dalish, they do have shoes, weird foot coverings of some nature. So they could have shoes. It's totally feasible for them to have them. I just kind of always assumed that the lore reason is so they could stay connected to the earth or whatever, to the ground, some nature reason.
Right. I just thought it was worth mentioning. So that's a little fun comment the fandom makes about how Fenris, Solus, Zevran, and DA2, Meryl, they don't wear shoes.
Zevran and DA2 doesn't wear shoes?
According to the internet.
Okay, well, according to the internet, lots of things are true. So let's move on from that. But anyway, so as back to the long walk, as many of our American listeners may know, this event in the Dragon Age universe bears almost an exact parallel to several events in our world. I want to go through a couple, and then Austin's going to go through one. And again, while this may not be the point of our podcast, we think it's really important for you as a player of this video game to understand that this isn't something that they just completely created out of their own minds, that it bears quite a resemblance to other events and things. So the first, probably the most known, I would say, event that this long walk compares to is the Trail of Tears. And this was an ethnic cleansing perpetuated by the United States President Andrew Jackson, starting in 1830, just prior to the Civil War. Approximately 60,000 members of the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations were forcibly removed from their ancestral homes in the southeastern part of the United States, and they were relocated to the area of the United States that is now the state of Oklahoma. Along the way, many of the indigenous members, they died from exposure, disease, or starvation. It's estimated that at least 6,000 people died during the Trail of Tears, and the groups, they walked almost 1,200 miles. And there is another lesser known instance that is the Long Walk of the Navajo, or the Long Walk to Bosque Redondo. And I bring this one up specifically because of the naming similarity. This ethnic cleansing and deportation occurred a little bit later than the Trail of Tears, starting in 1864, which is like 35 years after the Trail of Tears. It's either right at the end of the Civil War or like in the last years of it. And so members of the Navajo Nation in this one were forced to walk from their land in western Arizona to eastern New Mexico. And there were about 53 different individual marches over a 2-year period. A little bit different from the Trail of Tears also is that this death march was much more unexpected. There were tensions, of course, between the white settlers and the indigenous tribe, but this walk was not precipitated by a presidential proclamation or a law. But regardless, the march proceeded, and many of the Navajos were not prepared or were not allowed to prepare for their journey. And so a lot of the Navajo tribe began this walk exhausted or malnourished, others without adequate food and clothing, which probably contributed to more people dying during this walk than that probably would have. It's estimated that at least 200 people died during this 18-day walk, which is a lot of people for 2.5 weeks. And the groups, they walked over 300 miles in the long walk. And so I bring these up because they're pretty clearly have taken inspiration from both of these. We know that BioWare writers have made comparisons between the Dalish and indigenous tribes before. And so it's pretty clearly we're taking inspiration from these two, at least. For sure, the Trail of Tears, I'm not sure, the depth of knowledge that the BioWare writers have, but I'm confident to say that the Trail of Tears is for sure an inspiration here. But I know that Austin has a more literary example rather than like a more modern day history example. So I am going to turn it over to him for a few minutes.
Yeah. And this just kind of comes from, we've been talking about the Evanuris, and I have been bringing from other religions, comparing to the Evanuris. So this is just kind of where that brain is at. But a lot of this compares to the story of the Jews, the Hebrew people, escaping Egypt in the book of Exodus in the Bible. And so the Exodus story, obviously, we get Moses comes back. He says to Pharaoh, "You let my people go." Pharaoh says no. There's a bunch of plagues. He lets the Egyptians go, and they go off to their to the promised land, to the place that God has promised them. And then there's this long walk. Not really a long walk, but it is a long walk, but it's 40 years journeying through what's called the wilderness. And one of the things that really struck as this comparison for me was in the Codex, when they're talking about, at least in Tevinter, we had food and we had shelter. Here we have nothing but open sky. And that's pretty parallel to something that the people complained to Moses about. This is from Exodus 14, verse 12. It says, "Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Which is kind of that similar complaining there with the Exodus story. And so this is just another kind of comparison. I don't know if BioWare, overtly made this direct comparison. It's kind of hard to say. They're not really religious, but, the alienages very much draw inspiration from the ghettos in Europe, which also affected the Jews. So I think it's a fair comparison to make, that this could also be a comparison. And as we'll talk about later, the Dalish it's not really a copy and paste from one group. They're kind of piecemealed together from different oppressed groups throughout our actual history and our actual world.
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked about that on the podcast before, that why we think that's a little bit problematic. Don't get me wrong, like, I think the Dalish are really interesting. That's why we've had a whole season, dedicated to Elven lore. But we have talked about how it begins to be a little bit hard when there are problematic aspects, and we've said, or at least the writers have said, okay, this is inspired by X group of people, and then that group of people may wonder, like, oh, well, is this what the writer thinks about me? And it just opens up a whole lot of problems. And so let's move on a little bit, because I did have a few reflections, things I wanted to call out, and then a couple questions at the end that we can discuss. So the first thing I want to talk about is some differences, actually, between these events we've highlighted and the story that BioWare has given us. And so I think the first and most obvious difference between the Long Walk of the Elves and the Trail of Tears and other marches like it is that the elves, they were walking to a wonderful new homeland full of hope and full of opportunity, whereas the real life indigenous tribes were forced to relocate outside of their ancestral homeland. And so while they were given new land, it was smaller and not as bountiful. However, at the same time, this is where the Exodus story comes into play, because they were walking into a new homeland full of hope and full of opportunity. Now, yes, the leaders of that movement and the Exodus story did not quite make it to the promised land. And yes, we can also go into the fact that the elves' journey was nowhere near 40 years. And so there still are differences, but there are far more similarities, I think, than there are differences. And then the second difference that I really wanted to highlight is that the indigenous tribes in our real world were not slaves, at least explicitly, prior to their forced relocations. And additionally, they were forced to relocate, whereas the elves of Dragon Age did not have to relocate. They obviously wanted to, and they chose to, but they did not have to move to the Dales. All of that to say, I think it's pretty clear, though, that BioWare took inspiration from these historical events to create this in-universe event. And my first question that I have for us to discuss is, do you think that historical events such as these should be used as inspiration?
I think yes. Like my general consensus on this question is yes, because like when we take inspiration and we put these into fictional worlds and fictional stories, it kind of helps us digest them a little bit, or helps us bring meaning into them. And I think about, the parallels that Star Wars, the original trilogy, pairs to the Vietnam War. And that like is generally thought as a good thing, even though there are probably people who say that George Lucas shouldn't have done that into the original trilogy of Star Wars. But I mean, he's on record. It's the truth. Like, he drew inspiration from the Vietnam War for Star Wars. That's just a fact. And I think that if you want to draw inspiration from real world events, I think that's fine. And I think it's okay to do that as long as it's done well.
Yeah, I definitely hear that and agree completely that it's really important, I think, because when we draw from events in our own lives, or events that we've learned about, or events that touch our lives in some way, regardless of whether or not we were part of that group, I think that it's powerful for those of us who are consuming the media.
Mm-hmm.
However, it definitely is important to do it well, because it's easy for it to get a little bit, maybe to have unintentional consequences, or maybe you didn't think through whatever it was completely, and then other people pick up on things, and there's just a lot of factors that go into it. But I absolutely think that if we don't draw inspiration from the real world around us, like our creations are going to be a lot less powerful than they are now. So I definitely agree with that. And my next question is, do you think that this incorporation, specifically of the stories and struggles of indigenous tribes, do you think this counts as representation for them in the Dragon Age universe? And if so, is it good representation?
It kind of like goes both ways, because like if native people who play Dragon Age look at the Dalish and they see themselves, indigenous people see themselves in the Dalish, then I do think that does count as representation. But if they're going to use that as representation, I would then ask the question, how many Dalish people are voiced by indigenous people? How many like are like voiced in this way to show this kind of like representation? And so and I think that's where I get to where the point of like, I do think it counts as representation as long as the group feels represented. So I guess it's not really what I'm saying is it's not for me to say if it counts as representation. It's for the people who are being represented. And I think that where I draw the line is it good representation? Maybe not. I think that when you try to draw parallels like this with real world events, and then you either don't consult the people who that has affected, and you don't involve those people who are affected in whether they're VAs or writers or other things like that, I think then it becomes no longer good representation.
And I think that we should issue a disclaimer here, because we don't know if BioWare did that or didn't do that. We have no insider knowledge whatsoever. But I do agree with you that, as long as somebody feels represented by something and they can articulate that, I think they can have that interpretation. Absolutely. I don't think it's for me to say, no, this isn't representation for indigenous groups, because I'm not indigenous. That's not my prerogative to say. However, I can speak on whether or not this is representation for women. Like we each have the things we can speak to, but yeah. So I think we're leaving this discussion on the point that, like, yes, it's important for us to draw inspiration from real world history. We clearly think that BioWare has done that in this specific topic. And I also want to say the last kind of thing is that I think that as long as like one person has learned about like this real world history behind this video game event, like that's great. That's the goal for me. Like check A+, we're golden, because it is real. But if this has inspired you to further learning, 10 out of 10, A+. So I think that we're wrapping up on this discussion of the long walk, and we can go to the mid break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the establishment of Halamshiral.
Well, let's go to the mid break here.
So you like to read? What's wrong with that?
It's frivolous. There are more important things for me to do.
That's just her favorite.
Nobody asked you, Tevinter.
I couldn't finish the last one you lent me. I actually feel dumber for having tried.
It's literature. Smutty literature. Whatever you do, don't tell Varric.
No offense, but might I try? I've got a quick hand, after all. Let's see. Oh, when was the last time I slipped my hand into some dark hole? I remember. Long story, that.
You hurt my head sometimes, Solus.
Yes, I have been known to do that.
So welcome to the middle of the show, where we take time to thank our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Lisa M and Genesis, and welcome back officially to Lisa M. Thank you so much for y'all's support. Thank you to all of our patrons' support. If you would like to support us, you can do so at patreon.com/DALorecast. Another great way to support us is to leave us ratings or reviews. And if you leave us 5 stars and some kind words, we'll read it out on a future episode of the show. And so I have a Spotify comment to read today. This comes from Miras Venator, who on our Valisline episode. And so this says 5 stars. Started listening to the DA Lorecast in March and have binged it every workday. I just caught up. The hosts are so knowledgeable and it made me want to do another full replay of the series. Thank you so much for that comment and those kind words. We are so glad that we can get you through your workday. That's why we're here, is to provide you with knowledge and fun conversations about Dragon Age. And last, on that topic, if you want to continue to have awesome conversations about Dragon Age or other video games or Assassin's Creed, one of our other podcasts, you can do so by joining our Discord and hanging out with us on the internet and talking about all our shows, all our games. You know, we've got a dedicated Baldur's Gate 3 channel. You can talk about that, share your tabs, do whatever. It's a lot of fun, and you can do that in the Discord, which that link is found in the episode description. It's also found on our website, cupspodcasting.com. So you can find that there. And lastly, be sure to check out our merch store if you're looking for awesome merch that's Dragon Age related, such as if you are just a real hater of Lord Seeker Lambert, as someone unnamed on this podcast is, you can go there and buy our Lord Seeker Lambert Hate Club shirt. You can get awesome Grey Warden Athletic Club merch. It's a lot of fun, and you can do that at cupspodcasting.com. Find our merch store. And with that, that's all I got for the middle of the show.
All right, let's get back into it.
Abominations are always so awkward at family reunions. Have you ever seen an abomination? They are ugly.
Dorian, those words you say, what do they mean?
What, you mean like mendicant? Ultimatum?
No arse when you're mad. Pishanti Kothas. You're swearing, I know it.
Vishanta Kafas. It's Tevin, relics of the old tongue. We still use the colourful phrases.
And it means what?
Literally, you shit on my tongue.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
Okay, so we have discussed the long walk. We've discussed how they get to the Dales, but what happens when they get there? Well, there are quite a few things that happen, and we're going to give you a very short discussion of about 3 centuries of history. I should add, I would love to know more about this time period. I think this time period would make an amazing setting for a Dragon Age TV show or movie or book, whatever. I think it would be amazing because there's just a lot more room for them to expand the lore. So I think this would be a great area for them to do that. So let's dive in. First and foremost, and pretty much the very first thing that the elves do is establish the city of Halamshiral. You know that we go here multiple times during Inquisition. It is the former capital of the Dales and was actually the first city established by the elves since Arlathon was built. Halamshiral was built somewhere between -165 and -140 ancient. We're not really sure of the exact date here, but those are estimates. And fittingly, like we mentioned in the Codex earlier, the name Halamshiral translates to the end of the journey in the Elven language. And so they very much saw this is the place that was going to be their new homeland. This was going to be the new Arlathon. This was going to be the new Elvenon. This was their homeland, their new homeland. And so their goal, their main primary motivation here was to begin rebuilding their kingdom, attempting to reestablish their lore, their religion, their language, and their culture. And so when Halamshiral, the plans have been made, they've decided everything. They chose the location for it specifically because of the proximity to the Imperial Highway. If you're not familiar with the Imperial Highway, it's basically an interstate that was built by ancient Tevinter and spans most of Thedas. You can see it, or at least glimpse it, I think, multiple times throughout the games. You can see it in Dragon Age Origins, in Ostagar area. You can see it in Inquisition. When you are in the Frostback Basin, you can see it sometime in Dragon Age 2. I don't know when, but it goes over to Kirkwall too. Anyway, it spans almost all of Thedas. And if you want to learn more about the Imperial Highway, you should read Tevinter Nights, because one of the short stories, I think it's Jenna TV Dies in the End, has a big plot line there. So go read that. But anyway, so they wanted to build their capital city near the highway so that elves from all corners of the world could find the new empire easily if they just followed the road. And it's said that when the elves laid the very first stone to build Halamshiral, the people vowed that no human would ever set foot on the lands. The greatest elven warriors even vowed to protect the city and uphold this promise. They specifically invoked the names of Elgranon, Mythal, Andriel, and Gillenon when they vowed to protect Halamshiral. These warriors were the Emerald Knights. Now, I'm going to pause here because I presume that you have comments about the 4 specific members of the Evanurus who are invoked.
It's just interesting to that. You have obviously Justice and Vengeance who are invoked, and then you have like they're hunters, which you could also argue that like Andriel and Fallon Den could also be interpreted as god of travelers too. And Gillenon too, just like being goddess of the Hala, and the Hala tend to be like guides or companions for the Dalish, and kind of getting all of that. So I think that it makes sense, because I think those 4 for the Dalish in general, those are the most important to them. Elgranon, Mythal, Andriel, and Gillenon.
That's a hot take. I don't know if most important to them is, I don't know. I just feel like, I don't know. Maybe so. I don't know. I feel like these are the most aggressive of the gods. And I think Gillenon kind of takes a back seat in the aggressive tendency, but like she keeps making her creatures. And I think she does aggressive things just in a more hidey kind of way. Like she's hiding the evidence that she is more aggressive, more proactive rather than reactive. So to me, it's very much like, okay, Elgranon, Mythal, Andriel, these are the ones that will strike you down if you rise against them. Whereas some of the other ones are more of the kind of like, let me lie in wait and see what you do part of it, rather than being important versus lesser.
I do think it's interesting that June is not mentioned in this story at all.
Yes, I agree. I would have put him in this list over Gillenon.
Just because he's god of the craft, and they're building their new world, their new city. I don't know, but maybe it's just the specific warriors are, and maybe they're the most warlike of the gods as well.
Yeah, I guess so. But also at the same time, isn't it Durthaman that's starting wars with the other gods? So who knows? We don't know. Let's move on. I just thought we should pause there and talk about like, okay, interesting. So I said that the warriors that were created, they were the Emerald Knights. They're very famous in Thedas for being like the best warriors of all time. And during the height of Halamshiral and the Dales, the Emerald Knights actually acted also as city guards and border patrol. And so, as you can imagine, tensions escalate with the humans, especially as these like fearsome elven warriors are marching on borders with the human lands. The humans are nervous. They're very nervous. And so, when someone is full of fear, that fear kind of reverberates. And so the humans start to get nervous, and the elves say, okay, Emerald Knights, you are now charged with watching the humans if they cause any trouble. And so this continues to escalate tensions, and it unfortunately leads to the Exalted March to the Dales, led by the Chantry. And that basically wipes out the Dales, turns Halamshiral over into human hands, all kinds of stuff. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit. But I'll bring this up now because it's important to note that all of the Emerald Knights perished during the Exalted March. They were kind of like the last stand.
I'm thinking about in Thor Ragnarok when he says, like, oh, I always dreamed of being a Valkyrie until I figured out they were all women. The little kids who imagine, like, oh, this is what I want to be. These guys are awesome. Like, here's what I idolize. If I was a little kid, I would be like, I want to be an Emerald Knight. Those guys are awesome.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. For sure. So Halamshiral and the Dales remained under elven control for almost 300 years. I know we did a really quick switch there. They've established and then they are, getting defeated, but they do reign for 300 years. And they do fall during the Exalted March to the Dales in 220 glory. And it has technically been under Orlesian control since then, but the city is decidedly still elven. After the Exalted March, Orlais outlawed the worship of the Evanuris, disrupted any remaining elven settlements, and sent the remaining elves to live in alienages. Some elves, however, refused to give up their worship and their dream of a homeland, and they left. These became the Dalish tribes who retained the name of their second homeland, and they vowed to keep elven religion, language, and culture alive. Even today, Halamshiral's population is mostly elven. We're not sure of exact demographic breakdowns, but we know that at least 50% of the population is elven, which is why Halamshiral does not have an alienage. Wealthy humans instead live in one specific neighborhood named the High Quarter. We also know of another neighborhood named the Ash Quarter, though we're not really sure who lives there. Over the many years, though, since Halamshiral went into the hands of humans, there have been many elven rebellions. Some of these rebellions have even destroyed the human buildings like the Winter Palace and wealthy human neighborhoods. It seems that the elves of Halamshiral have not forgotten their second homeland, nor who took it away from them. So, with that, that's about all we know, lore-wise, of this time period of how they lose the homeland. But I wanted to open this up for thoughts, questions, discussions, whether you want to talk about the founding of Halamshiral, its loss, or even just how the city operates in modern day is up to you.
I just think that it's really interesting how, the humans, quarter themselves off and they don't have an alienage or anything like that. I just think that it's really, really interesting that it's been almost 1,000 years since the Exalted March on the Dales. It's been 822 if we take the end of Origin or end of Inquisition as the latest date we have. I know the short stories technically take place in 950 Dragon or something like that. But so 830 years. That's a long time and a long history of getting undone. And I think that I'm surprised that what I want to talk about is I'm surprised that Solus doesn't have more to say about being in the Winter Palace and Halamshiral, because I know he wasn't around for that, but I feel like he would have comments, and he doesn't really say anything if you take him other than him wearing that hideous hat.
Well, the hideous hat does have a lore meaning behind it. I'm not going to get into that now, but you can go look it up. It is basically a flag saying Dalish pride, first and foremost. However, I do agree with you that it is odd that he doesn't have more to say, because you know that he's slept there and gone into the Fade there. But I do think also the humans keep a tight leash on the city. We see that in the Masked Empire, which we'll talk more about in a couple months. But yeah, I do agree with you.
Yeah, but I think I don't really have any more thoughts on Halamshiral. other than like, I think I would be okay with Orlais if it wasn't for this history. Like, I would be annoyed with them. I wouldn't want to live there still, but I don't think I would have like such like vitriol for them because I feel like, when Tevinter no longer wants to be or is like pushed back to just Tevinter and like the Cunari lands, that Orlais is just kind of like, oh, well, we can be the new empire. And instead of being like, hey, let's not be like these oppressors, they decide to step into that power vacuum as the oppressors.
Well, and I think that's part of Orlais' history is that they've always wanted to be the oppressor, not the oppressors specifically. They've always wanted to be the top empire. And that goes back to their founding with Emperor Draken the First. Like, that was his goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a lot of Orlais lovers out there, but they do some heinous things. And they are heinous, and Celine included. And, we're Americans. We're familiar. Like, when you live in a place, you got to know, like, when we're proclaiming your pride for your country, like, your country inevitably does bad things too. I don't think there's a country out there that doesn't do bad things. And that's important to remember when we talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I definitely agree that if it wasn't for the Exalted March to the Dales, I would not hate Orlais nearly as much as I do. And I think the thing about it for me is like, okay, yes, Tevinter, Ferelden. Let me exclude Tevinter from that. Okay, yes, Ferelden, free marches. Like, you're racist. You're absolutely racist. And not that I'm going to excuse that, because I'm not. However, they're not also extremely sexist. They're not also extremely homophobic. They're not also extremely classist. And that's more of my issue with Orlais and Tevinter, is because they're like all of those things. The others only have a smattering of it. Whereas with Orlais and Tevinter, it's like, okay, let me check every box on the hatred list.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, well, do you want to get into our side character, or did you have more additional discussion points outside of this one specific thing?
I think I want to talk about our side character because our side character is also giving me a chance to talk about my favorite character.
Okay. Well, then let's get into it. So our side character for the day is an elf named Shiralis. You may not have heard of him, but he's actually really important to this story found in the comics. And this character is named Shiralis, or the Red Wraith. Keep that in mind if you know anything about the comics. But interestingly enough, we actually know almost nothing about the specifics of his story. We know that he is Dalish, and we know that when he was young, his clan was destroyed somehow, and that he was eventually taken in by another Dalish clan, but he never came to see them as family in the same way that his original clan was. We also know that he took the Valisleen of Elgernon. Shiralis appears in 2 of the comic series, Blue Wraith and Dark Fortress. So in Blue Wraith, Shiralis appears as an associate of the Blue Wraith, aka Fenris, aka Austin's favorite character. Together, they are freeing elven slaves, and Shiralis thinks that these slaves are going to be trained as mage killers, and he wants to infiltrate their group to see if that's true and to learn the mage killer skills himself. Fenris does not allow him to do this. Fenris basically says, no, you're not going to do that. A year passes, and Shiralis infiltrates a slave shipment bound for the same Magister's palace as before. He ends up being selected for, guess what? Special training as a mage killer. The Magister also plans to infuse Shiralis with red lyrium, similar to how Fenris was infused with regular lyrium. Fenris obviously does not approve. And so in Dark Fortress, it isn't until the next comic series, Dark Fortress, when Shiralis actually does get imbued with the red lyrium, which is what turns him into the Red Wraith. They also arm Shiralis with a sword created by the lyrium idol. It's unclear to me, and I've done research, it's unclear to me if this is the same sword that Samson and Meredith wield, which is called Certainty, but I would lean probably toward a yes on that one, but that is not confirmed. At the end of the comic, Shiralis' ritual ends up being completed despite interruptions from Sir Aaron Hawthorne and the Cunari. However, the ritual finishes and Sir Aaron and their Mabari are able to separate him from the sword. And so they do eventually kill him. However, I'm not sure he couldn't come back because, Fenris's abilities, he's got so many abilities, being the blue wraith, being infused with regular lyrium. It would make sense to me if the red wraith had even more power, because we know that red lyrium is much more destructive than regular lyrium. It would not surprise me whatsoever if it allowed him to come back from the dead or to be some kind of functionally immortal. And then I have 2 little trivia facts about Shiralis that I almost forgot. But the first one is that I'm wondering if there is a name connection between Shiralis' name and the Elven word for journey, which is Shiral, as we know from Halamshiral. I feel like it's too much of a coincidence to not be there. Maybe his name means something like journeyer, traveler, something like that. We don't really know. And then my second trivia fact is that it's interesting to me because when Fenris undergoes the lyrium ritual, he basically remembers nothing from his past. But Shiralis seems to retain his memories because he recognizes Fenris and even calls him friend. So I don't know if this is an effect of the red lyrium or if this is an effect of Fenris's trauma. Unclear.
So I have some theories about this a little bit. And I'm just going to say some things that we know about red lyrium. One, thanks to Bianca and her meddling, we know that red lyrium has the blight in it. And then we also know that red lyrium, at least from the idol, has some kind of mind tampering, mind control property. So there's probably some kind of sense of spirit or blood magic interference happening in there as well. So I'm wondering if there's a connection between red lyrium and mind controls, as well as the sentient darkspawn, who seem to have a sense of agency and memory retaining that is somehow interacting with the infused lyrium that's causing him to retain his memories.
I definitely think it's possible. We know there's fishy stuff going on with red lyrium, but I don't feel like we have enough information currently to make a proclamation either way.
And I think that's fair because I think, as far as we know, anyone who's experimented with red lyrium doesn't really know what it can do and how it's going to react in different ways. And I'm sure whatever magister or whatever that was doing this to Shiralis was just we used to do this ritual with lyrium. Well, we know red lyrium is even more powerful, so let's see if we can make an even more powerful wraith.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely think that is the reason that he was created, for sure.
All right, well, let's I think if you're done and you don't have anything else to add, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Yes, we definitely are.
All right, well, thank you for bringing this information. Thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Do you love Dragon Age? Have you always wanted to learn more about its vast world and detailed lore? Are you still attached to your hero of Ferelden, even a decade after Dragon Age Origins came out? Or maybe you're a newer fan, still discovering a new tidbit or quest every day.
Well, either way, the Dragon Age Lorecast is the podcast for you. I'm Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm Shelby, also known as Shecup.
And come and join us as we embark on a journey to explore and discover all things Dragon Age.
We'll discuss all kinds of topics, from Lyrium to the Chantry and the great mysteries of the old gods, and even more that even you BioWare superfans might not know about.
So come and listen on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. And always remember,
swooping is